Morning, everyone. Okay, let's try something else. Amandla. Viva feast must fall. Viva. Okay. I take it that everyone is awake now. Sorry, there's an echo. Is that okay? Welcome to the second day of the Remembering Movements Colloquium. I'm looking around and I think that probably most people were here last night, where we had a fantastic panel that I think set the scene for the conversations today and tomorrow. And I want to emphasize conversations. So even though we have 4 wonderful presenters, the general kind of mandate is to kind of raise ideas, questions, provocations for discussion amongst the rest of us. I'm going to introduce, my name is Noor Nieftagodien. I'm a lecturer at the university. And my role is quite simple. I'm going to introduce the speakers. My main task is to ensure that they are disciplined and keep to 19.5 minutes that they've been given to speak, so that we can have as much time as possible for conversations. Our 4th speaker has not arrived yet, and I will introduce the speakers in the order that they're going to speak, and hopefully when Carbon arrives, I can introduce them at that moment. So the order in which we are going to have the speakers, the first speaker will be Lindokuhle, then Lindy, and then KK, and then Carbon. He asked me to introduce him as such. KK Sithebe, whose the title of his presentation is Threading Jurisprudence, the Right to Protest Post Fees Must Fall. KK is a research advisor at the South African Human Rights Commission. Over to you. Yeah? Thank you.
Do I need this? Am I audible though? Oh, excellent. Morning, everyone. Firstly, my apologies for not joining yesterday's screening, and also for giving mixed messages that I'll be joining online. I had foreseen that this would happen to me, so I decided then to come and give this presentation in person. This paper was mostly written from a legal background, but conscious of the fact that its protest springs beyond just legalities. It also springs into humanities, causes of protest, and so on and so forth. So I then decided to not give much credence to the legal aspect to it, except for my main argument, which is a case of, I'll get it here, Mlungwane. But before I get to the Mlungwane case, I just want to start by saying that the South African socio-political landscape, both during and after apartheid, underscores the critical significance of the right to protest. The apartheid regime was used anti-protest laws to violate human rights, suppress labor and labor unions, and clamp down on political dissents. In this context, the right to protest became emblematic of broader struggles against authoritarianism and social oppression. With the advent of constitutional democracy in 1994, South Africa adopted a progressive Bill of Rights that that expressly protects the right to assemble, demonstrate, picket, and present petitions. Section 27 of the Constitution enshrines the right to protest, recognizing peaceful protest as a cornerstone of participatory democracy. That said, it is important to take stock of the development of jurisprudence regarding the right to protest, to evaluate whether the courts have expanded or restricted this right, identifying key moments of progress and regression, and interrogating the extent to which constitutional protections have translated into meaning practice for protesters on the ground. Central to tracking such developments are 2 issues: fees must fall, and the Mlungwane case, which was before the Constitutional Court. The former, meaning fees must fall, introduced a new paradigm rooted in the pursuit of social justice, decolonialism, and the right to education, whilst the latter, which is the Mlungwane case, addressed how bureaucracy can frustrate the right to protest. I present here that the right to protest is merely for those without fora, But I equally submit that even with fora, the right to protest remains significant in that it shows camaraderie, in that it shows force, in that it shows power. And one of this was where I get this from was the March to Pretoria in 1956. The Women's March to Pretoria, yes, they had petitions. Yes, I think they were allowed to submit their petitions, and they could have submitted their petitions in private. But the reason they chose to form the groups that they did, the reasons they decided to travel the long distances that they traveled was to rally women firstly, but to show force secondly, to show unity thirdly, but to show camaraderie fourthly, and to declare that if you strike a woman, you strike a rock. Watinta bafazi, watinta mbowoto. I will not go much into Section 27 as it reads in the Constitution, except to say the Constitutional Court, in a case called Satao versus Gavas, it was Mogoeng who delivered the main judgment. In the main, he said, the right to freedom of assembly is central to a constitutional democracy. It exists primarily to give voice to the powerless. This includes groups that do not have political or economic power and other vulnerable groups. This is self-evident. I will not narrate on it further. The important part, I now learned that my favorite word is undergird. So you'll hear it a lot as I read. And this part I'm very proud of, hence I insist on reading it as it is. I submit as follows. I write that fees must fall represent a significant reawakening of protest culture in democratic South Africa. Whilst previous wave of protests have centered on labor dispute or service delivery failures, fees must fall introduced a new paradigm rooted in the pursuit of social justice, decolonization, and the right to education. There's an author, Alexander P., who wrote an article in 2010, Rebellion of the Poor, South Africa's Service Delivery Protest. He captured this. He says, part of the protest post-apartheid and including fees must fall, he terms it a culmination of the disappointment of the fruits of democracy. And I felt that it was very aptly in capturing the fees must fall because, and I continue, to view fees must fall as having changed the landscape of the right to protest, one has to take into account the foundation laid by pre-1994 protest, coupled with an understanding that the protest is undergirded by legitimate factors such as unemployment, increase in fees, which is viewed as a barrier towards access to further education, and young people finding their voices. Lastly, on fees must fall, I say fees must fall illustrated that protest is in a constitutional democracy is not merely a right to passively not a right to be passively protected, but an active tool for reshaping political discourse and policy priorities. And I think that fees must fall did this quite clearly in prioritizing, in seeing that the right to further education and the funding thereof is prioritized. Now I enter into my last argument, which is the Mnungwana judgment. So the Mnungwana case is about a group of people who protest at the Cape Town Civil, what is it called, ICC. And they're very peaceful. There's just 15 of them. However, because they did not issue a notice of their protest in terms of the Regulation of Gathering Act, they are then issued fines and so on and so forth. To their wisdom, they did not leave that hanging. They did not say, it's fine, we just got suspended fines, we should leave them. They submitted that, even if you did not give notice. Actually, they submit that part of the section 29 of the Regulations of Gathering Act, the virtue, the requirement that you must give notice is a violation of the right to protest. And of course, in a democratic dispensation such as ours, one can argue that, yes, of course, if you're going to protest, you ought to give notice, you ought to give sufficient notice. But I submit that that's not correct, and the court agrees with me. But I want to take a more controversial assessment of the judgment. So what the court says? No. The court frames the question as saying, is the failure to provide adequate notice a violation of the right to protest? That's a very simplistic view of the court in framing the question. I am saying the court was conservative. Actually, what the court meant to say was, is the right to protest superior to other rights such as property, life, dignity, and so on? Because the purpose of a notice is partially to protect those rights. Purpose of giving a notice is to protect property, is to make sure that there's sufficient police to guard the roads as people protest and so on. So I'm saying that the framing of the question by the court was it was a cop-out. It was an easy way out of saying, look, given all the rights in the Bill of Rights, does the right to protest, is the right to protest superior to others or not? And how do I find that the court decided to cop out? I present, I think, 4 arguments in the main. So I say that the court, this question, as I intimated above, is not the right question to ask. This is borne by the rest of the judgment. In outlining the background, the court acknowledges that the facts of the case, that the protest in question was peaceful. However, the court later frames the remedy as the criminalization of unconvening gathering is unconstitutional, regardless whether the subsequent gathering is violent. So although the court has already acknowledged that in this case we're dealing with a very peaceful one, the court said even if it was to turn violent, it would still be a violation of their right to protest by requiring them to submit a notice prior. Secondly, the court was at pains pointing out the hurdles put in place by the apartheid regime in the Tsueli and SEC cases and efforts to dismantle this hurdle post-apartheid. The court would have never went through this exercise if it did not want to sort of like put a hierarchy of all the other rights in the Bill of Rights vis-a-vis the right to protest. Thirdly, the court, in its cost-benefit analysis, held that the right to protest is too important. This is the wording in the judgment, actually. Too important to introduce any limitations through the regulations of gathering. Fourthly, the court dismisses an assumption that unnotified gatherings are inherently prone to become violent, stating that the implications of this submission is that gatherings that have been notified would necessarily be peaceful. That was not the case. The court emphasizes that criminalization, even where gatherings are peaceful, has the chilling effect on the exercise of the right to protest, particularly for marginalized groups who may lack the resources or institutional support to navigate bureaucratic requirements. As my last submission, I say this is testament to my assertion that the court was cognizant of the significance of the right to protest, but also that the regulating this right in any fashion, I emphasize, is a way of limiting its exercise, which is antithetical to its inclusion in the Constitution and the values of a democratic dispensation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, KK. And didn't require me to show you a yellow card and then a red card. I think it's really interesting, you know, during Fees Must Fall, the right to protest, as is the case in campaigns across the country, became an important source of contestation. There's been a long debate at universities about the right of students and workers and other people to protest. And in fact, notwithstanding the judgment that you focused on, the situation that pertains at the university now is in fact considerably more conservative than it was prior to Fees Must Fall. And what is mobilized by the management is a long kind of bureaucratic process that is aimed at making it incredibly difficult for students to protest, in particular, students who are aligned to pro-Palestinian movements. So there's a concerted effort to make it difficult for students to organize even a basic activity. As soon as you have the word Palestine in it, then a very kind of conservative bureaucratic process kicks in. So it's really interesting how the kind of law says one thing, and these so-called progressive spaces, the universities, in fact, have moved in the opposite direction, in fact, principally because of the Fees Must Fall movement. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, Lindiwe Malindi, whose paper is entitled Remembering the Grenada Revolution and Thinking with the Archipelago from Solomon House. Lindy is a PhD student in sociology here at Wits University. She is interested in the spatial dynamics of radical politics and uses islands and archipelagos in a PhD to think through questions of coloniality and decolonization. Thanks, Lindy. Over to you. I think you must use one of those.
Hello, hello, hello. No, he's going to turn it up. Okay. Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. I'm feeling a bit anxious, a little bit less prepared than I'd intended to be, but it's nice to see a lot of familiar faces, and hopefully we can have a nice conversation. Okay, so the title of this panel is Remembering the Student Worker Movement. My presentation is not really about remembering the student worker movement. It's more about trying to think about the kind of possible futures of campus-based organizing through the Grenada Revolution. So it's kind of remembering the Grenada Revolution in order to be able to think about politics today and in the future. My premise that I start with is that Solomon House, which was the occupation of former Senate House here at Wits, and the other occupations that characterized 2015, 2016, I conceive of them as experiments in decolonial space making, and I conceive of them, and I invite you to conceive of them as metaphorical island spaces. And when I say that the occupations, and I could say a lot about this, but I don't have a lot of time, I could paint a picture, but I think just the space of the occupation, intuitively, I hope you're with me. So when I say that the occupations were islands, I'm not saying that they were islands in the sense that we've been conditioned to see islands through Western tropes and discourses, but they were rather islands in an archipelago. So I'll hopefully have time to say a bit more about this later, but for now, let me say that the word archipelago, and actually, Taz, can you put up my map? It's fine, don't worry, you can, sorry. Taz is gonna put up a map of the Caribbean in a minute, so the word archipelago refers to an island grouping, but the important thing to note is that no archipelago is naturally existing. Every single archipelago, including the Caribbean, is a formation or an assemblage that is produced by agency, given a name, that is brought together either through language or through a decision to make a political alliance, or through some kind of cultural affinity, or through a kind of colonial demarcation. These are British islands, these are French islands, and so, you know. And so, with the archipelago, just as a grouping, an archipelago can be made, it can also be unmade, it can be reconfigured. New islands can be brought into this archipelago, islands can be cast out of it, so it's an inherently unstable formation. And finally, every island is constituted and shaped by its relations to other islands, to the sea, to the mainlands and continents. And even Robben Island, to bring it home, which maybe we think of as this kind of quintessentially small, bounded, isolated space, it had to be produced that way. And even when the full power of the state was used to produce it that way, it wasn't fully successful. It was still a porous space to some extent. Okay, so that being said, the island is a particular kind of space that presents or highlights spatial dynamics that, in all space, inform political possibilities as well as limitations and vulnerabilities. So, my suggestion is that we can enrich our understanding of Solomon House and of the tactic of occupation and of other kinds of experiments in space making by looking towards islands, real islands, and other kinds of metaphorical island spaces. So, for example, Haiti, Cuba, Zanzibar, and the Seychelles, these are some of the islands that I think offer insights into the relationship between revolutionary politics or radical politics, and islandness, and the geography of islandness. So I will be looking at Grenada, which is there we go, which is the small tri-island state in the Caribbean, and no, that's Guyana. Up there, below St. Vincent, anyway, you see Guyana, Trinidad, Tobago, Grenada, there it is. It has it's part of the Caribbean archipelago, it's also part of the Lesser Antilles, the Leeward Islands. It has, its grouping goes by many names. And they had a revolution between 1979 and 1983 that I want to talk about. And just to emphasize that this is a metaphorical reading, I'm not presuming a direct equivalence between Grenada and Solomon House, or between the events of 2015, 2016, and the kind of full-blown revolution of Grenada, but I do still think that there are insights to be drawn out of the Grenadan experience and questions to be asked through it. I realize I'm actually keeping an eye on time. What? Oh, shit. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to skip through the history. I won't skip through the history. Okay, so Grenada itself is an archipelago. It's made up of 3 islands, the main island of Grenada, then Petite Martinique, and Carriacou. It's only 344 square meters. It has a population around 100,000. And it was one of the last regions, the Leeward Islands there, was one of the last groups to be colonized in the Caribbean. And that was due to the resistance of the Caribs who inhabited the island at the time of European expansion. Because it was one of the last regions to be colonized, a lot of escaped enslaved people from the other islands went down there for refuge and practiced marinage on these smaller leeward islands, which are kind of defined by their small size, but also their mountainous interiors and their forests. So the forests became these space of like building runaway communities. The Caribs were largely displaced or exterminated by the French, who eventually managed to establish a settlement there in 1649. Grenada then passed over into British hands, where it was basically very quickly turned into a sugar plantation in a very short amount of time. So there had been about 1,200 enslaved Africans over the period of French colonization, and by 1795 there was 110,000. There was a major slave rebellion in 1795 that was following the Haitian Revolution as well as the American and French revolutions, but it was quelled, and the Africans in Grenada remained enslaved until abolition in 1833, whereafter the fundamental structure of plantation society was adapted and essentially maintained, until labor uprisings in the 1950s, which saw the rise of a leader called Eric Gary, who was initially very popular, but then became increasingly despotic and a bit unhinged. And he became the first post-independence prime minister. And after the elections became even more despotic, and under these conditions, the New Jewel movement began plotting a revolution. A kind of Marxist-Leninist movement, the New Jewel movement, but also with influences of Black Power, the broader kind of Caribbean left. Bandung was an influence, and they were kind of committed to this new international economic order that was proposed at this kind of moment of decolonization. So, The revolution then began in March 1979 with the seizure of the military barracks, the ousting of Eric Gary, and the proclamation of the People's Revolutionary Government, the PRG. After the coup, Maurice Bishop, who became the first Prime Minister of Revolutionary Grenada, a very charismatic character, went on the radio, went on national radio, made a speech basically reassuring everyone and encouraging everyone, all the people of Grenada, to take up the cause, to converge, to support the revolution in any way they could, which is a call that was taken up by the people. And I think, by all accounts, it was characterized by joy, excitement, energy, and participation following the coup. The revolution made remarkable achievements in housing, in health, water, electrification, employment, infrastructure, working conditions, cultural production, economic growth, and popular democratic participation. The revolution's achievements in the area of education were particularly extraordinary and transformative. So let me just say briefly that it's relevant to note that secondary education was made free, uniforms and books were made free, the quality and number of schools was drastically improved, a Centre for Popular Education was established, and functional literacy was reduced to 2% within 1 year. Maurice Bishop called the revolution a big and popular school. And in all of this, as with all the other achievements of the revolution, it owes as much to the government, to the PRG, as it did to the enthusiastic participation and volunteer work of the Grenadian people. The NJM was, the New Jewel movement, was explicitly concerned with the unfinished business of decolonization. A new curriculum was designed in collaboration with teachers, the old British textbooks were thrown out, new publications were produced that represented Caribbean people, centered their experience, and used familiar scenarios as the basis of teaching. Paulo Freire himself was involved in the Centre for Political Education's literacy program, and the entire education system was concerned not only with formal learning, but also with conscientization. And a related aspect that I do want to draw attention to is the revolution's commitment to transforming gender roles and reorganizing society on the basis of gender equality. So a number of laws were passed, paid maternity leave was introduced, and there's a kind of broad agreement that, to give it numbers, an 85% agreement that the revolution saw the overall improvement in the condition of women, the transformation of women from an exploited underclass to full participants in the public sphere in political life. And there's some caveats that are coming up if I even have time. So education was instrumental to this. So the Marie Show Reader, which was one of the publications that was produced by the Centre for Popular Education, this is what Shalini Puri has to say about it. She says, the Marie Show Reader also sought to contribute to the revolutionary restructuring of Grenada. Hence, it also represented some unfamiliar things so as to normalize them. Girls and boys helping with washing, cleaning, and childcare. A father feeding a baby. Mother and father both cooking in the kitchen and cooking local food, like fish and bananas. So, in all of this, the revolution was definitely imperfect, but also hugely popular and undoubtedly momentous. Fidel Castro, who had come to power in 1959 through the Cuban Revolution, called it a big revolution in a small country. In fact, as the first and only socialist-orientated revolution in the Anglophone Caribbean, it was, in David Scott's words, a world historical event in the modern history of revolutions. The Grenada Revolution gave oxygen to the entire regional left. It was international in its orientation, in its solidarities, in its ambitions. And the US was This was kind of uncovered in a US report. It was even more threatened by Grenada than it was by the Cuban Revolution or by the revolution in Nicaragua. Because it was a revolution of Black English-speaking people and therefore risked influencing African Americans. In the context of the Cold War and in a moment where the kind of wave of decolonization, where most countries were actually independent, there was a very real anxiety that the success of the revolution was setting a bad example. So from a South African perspective, we should begin by noting that the Grenadian people participated in the very first anti-apartheid protests in the world in 1951. Continuing this tradition, the PRG, one of its first acts was to expel Barclays Bank from Grenada. Bishop himself vehemently condemned the apartheid regime and consistently called out the hypocrisy and complicity of the Reagan administration. Apartheid was discussed at various levels in Grenadian society, and in order to enable them to conduct international diplomacy, the PRG actually gave honorary Grenadian citizenship and Grenadian passports to around 50 ANC members, including Thabo Mbeki, who was a holder of a Grenadian passport. Mandela named Maurice Bishop in his speech at Oliver Tambo's funeral in 1993, I believe it was. Another parallel is that Grenada has its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which started in 2001, which brings me kind of to the end of the revolution. And the reason that the Grenada Revolution has not been kind of accorded its proper place in the history books is because of the way it ended. So the revolution reached an abrupt and devastating end on the 19th of October 1983, when a factional conflict developed within the PRG around the question of leadership. It escalated rapidly, and basically by the end of it, Maurice Bishop and 7 other members of the PRG had been executed by the People's Revolutionary Army. Government was then taken over by a new revolutionary military council that placed the shell-shocked, traumatized people under a 24-hour shoot-to-kill curfew. And then 12 days later, citing concern for the welfare of American citizens in Grenada, the US Army invaded and bombed the island extensively. So, let me try to be fast here by saying that the US invasion was significant in terms of the history of communism and neoliberalism, in terms of disciplining the left in the Caribbean. But the thing that makes remembering the Grenada Revolution difficult beyond that is that it collapsed from within due to factionalism, that Maurice Bishop, who was a really beloved figure in Grenada, was actually killed by members of the People's Revolutionary Army. And so kind of memories of the Grenada Revolution are shrouded in kind of trauma and shame about the kind of failure of the revolution. And I think that this combination of achievements, momentous achievements and failure makes remembering the Grenada Revolution even more pertinent for this discussion, for radical politics in general, and for thinking about occupations, about island making as a kind of tactic. So, I have a few points that I wanted to make. Noor, if you'll allow me to make just one of them. Just one, okay. So, one thing that I think is relevant about the kind of geography of the island here is that the Grenadians, Grenada is a small polity that made their revolution in a sea that the mighty USA considered and still considers to be its domain. It's lake, it's backyard. And this is one of Maurice Bishop's famous quotes. He says, Grenada ain't nobody backyard. And he really pushed back against that. The US plotted the overthrow of the revolution from day one and engaged in a constant campaign of destabilization. So, in 1980, a year after the revolution began, a bomb was detonated during a rally under a stage where many PRG leaders, including Bishop, were seated. And although this mass assassination attempt was unsuccessful, several people were injured and 3 schoolgirls were killed. So these very real threats to the revolution led to its militarization, and the bombing contributed to a siege mentality, to increased centralization, increased surveillance, increased extrajudicial violence, and militarization in general. And as a sign of that, I mean, after the bombing, the majority of new recruits for the militia were women. Within a year, women made up 30% of the Grenadian militia. So even though this violence was necessary, it's argued that it was overly romanticized and that the normalization of violence was a key element in the revolution's demise. So this is one of the things that Grenada asks us to consider. How to do revolution or radical politics surrounded, outgunned, and knowing that there are external forces working with internal elements, I use this word intentionally, to destabilize what you're doing. How to use what may be necessary violence without it becoming an ingrained means of conflict resolution. And that is just one of the many things that I wanted to say today. Cool, thank you.
Thanks very much, Lindy. Welcome, Carbon. Thanks, and it's just really for Carbon. I am imposing very strict time on it so that we can have a conversation. So apologies for kind of passing time notes, but that's my job, okay? Thanks, Lindy, for asking us to think beyond our own movements. Because I think that one of the challenges that we face in South Africa is a kind of parochialism and a sense of exceptionalism. And I think it's really critical for us to kind of think beyond our own movements, first of all, in a Pan-Africanist way, but in a meaningful Pan-Africanist way, and also beyond that. And I think that what you've done is to expand our horizons and to think internationally, but also to think of an archipelago not just as an island, but as connected islands. And that it's those connections, I think, that are critically important. Before I proceed, I just want to check whether we can bring Lindokuhle in now, and then we'll get to you at the end. We started with him, but we had some technical challenges. So I just want to try and bring him in again. So Lindokuhle, I've already introduced you. I hope that we have sorted out the technical issues, so please go ahead. And I'm going to, when your 18 minutes are up, I'm going to cough into the microphone to alert you to the fact that you have 1.5 minutes left. Thank you.
No, thank you. Can you hear me properly this time?
Yes, perfectly. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. So most reflections on the student protests of 2015 seem to focus on a key few themes, such as different organizing practices witnessed in the student protests of 2015, the anger of the so-called Black born-free generation, and against the slow pace of transformation and the corruption of the new Black elite. And also on how movements democratized the idea of the intellectual and made the site of struggle equally the site of intellectual postulation and knowledge generation. Another important theme that has emerged when studying the 2015 student protest is how the movement shook the foundations of the state and how the state reacted to the protest, and what might this mean for future configurations of power in South Africa. The common thread that binds the different themes that have been associated with the start of the 2015 student protest is that both the public and academic popular discourse takes the 2015 student protest as one continuous whole with differently articulated pressure points. The common idea has been that while there were different movements across the different campuses, this difference in the main simply reflected a difference in emphasis and articulation of the different demands of the whole movement. According to this line of thought, while Open Stellenbosch may have emphasized more the question of language, it doesn't mean that it was not in solidarity and full agreement with the demands of the Rose Must Fall movement at UCT and the Fees Must Fall movement that started at FETS. But due to various political and historical considerations, different campuses may have focused on different aspects of the broader student movement. What has not yet received much attention from most scholars and public commentators that talk about the student protests of 2015 is what were these student protests offering ideopolitically to the South African polity, and whether the different conceptual articulations of the ideopolitical offerings of the different campaigns can coexist side by side. While it may indeed be true that the different student campaigns in different campuses may have had a connection that connected them all together in solidarity in the fight to bring about a different state of affairs in South Africa, I argue that this categorical kindness towards the 2015 student protest is stretched too thin. I posit that there are fundamental ideological differences that showed themselves up in the student protest of 2015. That to argue that the student movement of that year form part of one continuous whole would not be entirely convincing. Focusing here on Fees Must Fall and RMF, while the popular public and scholarly discourse of the two movements under investigation has taken these two movements as one continuous whole, I want to argue that these two movements offer two fundamentally different movements that form part of separate political traditions in the history of South African political thought. I argue that while Rose Must Fall movement was fundamentally opposed to the South African Constitution, the document that founds the South African polity, the Fees Must Fall movement, on the other hand, complemented it. While the Rose Must Fall movement repudiated the idea of the South African polity, the Fees Must Fall movement relied on this very idea to push forward its demands. Peter Hudson, in his paper, The Reproduction of Racial Inequality in South Africa, asked the question of how colonialism lives in the democratic state of post-1994 South Africa. Hudson argues that those who have attempted to ask this question have been too quick to agree with the idea of the democratic breakthrough. And with the idea of the democratic breakthrough taken as a given in one's analysis, one easily lands on the inertia argument in explaining the presence of colonial relations in the post-1994 democratic state. The idea of those who hold on the inertia argument is that the structural motor that produced and reproduced colonialism in South African society is no longer functioning, and therefore eventually the colonial relations that came with it will eventually dissipate. Hudson, however, finds issue with the underlying assumption of the argument, that is, of taking the democratic breakthrough as a given. For Hudson, the idea of the democratic breakthrough that characterizes the past is questionable. For him, it is true that South Africa is a democratic state. However, it is equally true that it is still colonial as ever. The task is to give a theoretical analysis of how does democracy and colonialism coexist within the South African state without threatening the continued existence of one another. His conclusion is that this is done through the making South Africa unconscious of its colonialism. Prior to 1994, the political antagonism in South Africa were bare. South Africa was under colonial apartheid rule, and it was conscious of this colonial structure in its DNA. The colonial structure was visible in its physical, Manichaean geographical structure of the country. It was a country cut in two opposing zones, the zone of being where the white settler resided, and the zone of land being where the colonized native resided. The colonial Manichaean situation was well known and documented in the political discourse. Everywhere one went, there were signs Europeans only or non-Europeans only. It was a country divided along the color line. In this colonial Manichaean situation, black represents lack while white represents plenty. Biko made the observation that while it is a miracle to live up to adulthood in the township, on the other side, where the source of the evil of the township emanates, the white settler lives in a life of plenty. The situation in the township is a direct result of the situation in white society. the existence of the life of plenty in white society is sustained by the existence of perpetual death in the township. The existence of the township, and to exist in the manner described by Fanon and Biko, is the possibility condition for the life of plenty in white society. There is a contradiction, however, in this colonial situation. While the existence of the township life is the possibility condition for the colonial situation, because this condition under colonial relations is unable to be absorbed in the colonial order, it at the same time functions as the condition of impossibility of this colonial order. It is precisely the impossibility of the colonized subject to be digested by the colonial order that makes it impossible for this subject to be concealed. It is a constant feature of the symbolic order of South Africa. The Black know full well that they stay in Soweto simply because they are Black. They use substandard facilities because they are Black. They are educated in the way that they're educated because they're Black. And this antagonism has no resolution. There is nothing the Black subject under apartheid conditions can do to escape that condition as a Black subject, subjected to all the apartheid laws that govern Black people. Even capitalism under apartheid rules does not need to hide its exploitative nature under the veil of free and equal labor market, like it can do in a typical capitalist democratic state. For the Black subject under colonial apartheid rule, the fact of Blackness is constantly with them like their own shadow. What this means is that in the colonies, there's no need for the superstructure. The base is enough. Hence, Fanon made that famous statement that in the colonies, the economic substructure is also superstructure. But something happens in 1994. The master-slave relation between the white settler group and the indigenous Black subject appears to disappear. For the first time in the history of South Africa, there is a universal suffrage. Black people are able to participate in the political direction of their country as free and equal citizens with their white counterparts. The South African Constitution of 1996 gives equal rights and privileges to all citizens, regardless of race. And just like that, with a stroke of a pen, the South African Constitution brought under one socio-political order political subjects that could not be reconciled under colonial apartheid regime. The 1994 democratic breakthrough appeared to have finally resolved the antagonism that had once in the past obeyed the rules of Aristotelian logic of reciprocal exclusivity, as Fanon characterized the colonial situation. The Black after 1994 believed themselves to no longer be slaves of the white master. They no longer stayed in Soweto simply because they were Black. They could now be able to move to what were previously white-only suburbs. Even the popular discourse seemed to embrace this breakthrough. However, while the South African political discourse had shifted in 1994 to a discourse of South Africa that seemed to have resolved the unresolvable Aristotelian contradiction of its apartheid colonial era, the material condition on the ground that gave rise to the contradiction in the first place had not changed. While the white master colonial subject and the Black slave colonial subject had disappeared in the dominant political public discourse, the material condition that gave rise and defined these two subjects did not disappear in the lived realities of the post-1994 political situation. The only change was that the country seemed to no longer be conscious of its colonial character. That is, while we were all aware of the reality itself, the reasoning explaining the reality no longer sought answers from the colonial structure of South Africa. For Peter Hudson, the insertion of democracy into the South African symbolic order makes the symbolic order unconscious of its colonial character. In a typical capitalist society, the exploitation of the worker is hidden behind the free exchange of commodities in a commodities market. The worker freely sells his labor power in the labor market and his price is subject to the market determinations. Marx shows, however, that it is not in the market circulation that the real crime of capitalist society lies. It is in production. The real crime takes place in the factory floor where the labor is made to reproduce value that is more than what is compensated for. This crime is concealed, however, by the fact that the laborer sold his commodity, labor power, in a free labor market as a free agent in accordance with the dictates of the market. Thus, we see that the combination of capitalism with liberal democracy has the effect of repressing the class antagonism under the democratic regime of individual rights and equality. Democracy and capitalism therefore complement each other. Capitalism needs the juridical regime of democracy to hide its crime. The labor who sells his labor power in the markets needs to be a free agent and not coerced, at least legally, to sell his labor. Therefore, democracy does not need to hide the product of capitalist symbolic, the homo economicus. It complements it. It is the product of the colonial symbolic order that it needs to hide, the self-identification in racially antagonistic terms. And this is exactly what democracy does to the South African political situation of post-1994. It becomes the superstructure that was missing in the colonial apartheid situation. South Africa, through the insertion of democracy in the symbolic order, no longer identified as white or black, but as free and equal citizens of the republic who also participate in the market as free agents. And it is through the insertion of democracy and capitalism that South Africa conceals its colonial order. But the colonial material realities of colonial apartheid continue to reproduce themselves, but under different symbolic discourses. Colonial South Africa has now become unconscious of itself. However, we know it is there because we can see its effect. But because it now uses different signifiers, it gives rise to different political subjects. Through the insertion of democracy and capitalism, colonial South Africa in its symbolic order does not have white settler masters and black native slaves, but free and equal citizens who can be described in classic Marxist political discourses of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. It is this social transformation that allows South Africa to continue to be a colonial political situation without invoking its political subjects, classic colonial subjectivities. But the colonial political subjects remain there, just that they do not see themselves in those terms. Their colonial subjecthood is repressed. The Rose Must Fall movement was quite successful in making conscious this unconscious colonial character of South Africa. It brought back into the public discourse the long-forgotten colonized native subject. In its mobilization, it moved away from the common post-1994 political subjectivities of the working class, the poor, and the marginalized, and the ruling elite. It brought back the colonial subjectivities of the black colonized and the white colonizing settler class. In its founding statement, it centers the black experience as the locus of enunciation of its struggle and clearly locates whiteness as the root cause of the evils faced by the black subject. I will not quote that long quote from the founding statement of the RMF, but it is important to note that from the RMF founding statement, there's no reference made to the popular political subjectivities that I have argued became hegemonic in the post-1994 political discourse. That is the subjectivities of the working class, the poor, the marginalized, nor does it make reference to the ruling elite. In the RMF lenses, the South African symbolic order is seen again in its pre-1994 Manichean framework as a society consisting of the colonizer and the colonized. The dehumanizing practices of the post-1994 political situation are faced, according to the movement, only by Black people to the collective benefit of the white class. What this framework does is that it brings to the fore what RMF comrades called at the time the invisible hand of whiteness. For RMF, white settlers in South Africa have, since 1994, receded to the background as a fundamental contradiction in the country. And the Black ruling elite represented by the ANC have taken their place. The very choice of the instrument of instigation, the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, was instrumental in this analytical framework of the movement. Rhodes for the RMF movement was a symbolic representation of the white power structure of South Africa. According to the movement, you could not explain the Marikana massacre without invoking the spirit of Rhodes, and by extension, the conditions of Black laborers across South Africa. Nor can you talk about the spatial injustices of the country without invoking the hand of Rhodes. And the movement, in theoretical agreement with Hudson, did not buy into the argument of a democratic breakthrough and called into question the very idea of South Africa. In its founding statement, it repudiated the South African Constitution as a racist document that sustains the colonial relations of power in South Africa. In its analysis, rather than making a break with the colonial past of South Africa, the South African Constitution acts as a facilitator in the continued reproduction of the apartheid colonial relations under new guise through the insertion of democracy into the symbolic order. The repudiation of the South African Constitution has profound political implications. Because of the new political imaginary that came after 1994 democratic dispensation, political mobilization in the country was contained within a South African constitution, which does not give room for a political subject formation like a colonized black and a white settler colonizing subject. All dominant political parties in South Africa, from the left to the right, hold the South African constitution as sacrosanct. The constitution is not held in high regard only in established political parties, but even in civil society. The constitution became the ground for any political mobilization that took place in the country, both through electoral politics and even outside of electoral politics. Even AZAPO, the one political party that boycotted the processes that gave rise to the very constitution, found itself as one of its biggest defenders. Almost all big protests that have shaped South Africa post-1994 appeal to the South African Constitution for their legitimacy. The Kennedy Road Shack settlement protest in Durban, which led to the formation of the well-known Abahlali Basemjondolo movement, was a response to years of broken promises from the government. The TAC demanded the constitutionally enshrined right to health, and Statane was killed for simply fighting for basic service delivery. The RMF movement made a fundamental political break with this tradition of protest. The use of the constitution as the ground from which all political mobilization took place in the country limited the scope of political mobilization, and a priori foreclosed any real emancipatory politics for the colonized black subject. For how do you even begin to emancipate that which does not exist? To use the constitution as a ground redirected the main antagonism in the South African society. The problem shifted from being a structural problem of a colonial society inherently structured to produce two interdependent and contradictory societies, the white settler colonial society, whose existence survives from the existence of the black colonized society. The dominant discourse that came as a result of using the South African Constitution as ground was the notion that the problem in South Africa and why the colonial material conditions continue to exist was the ANC government. The RMF movement was very vocal in rejecting the characterization of the ANC as the main problem in the country, and by that fact, the main antagonism to the movement. The ANC and the so-called black elite are willing or unwilling agents of whiteness. Their actions, while they might bring about individual material gain, collectively act in dehumanizing the colonized native to the collective benefit of the white settler class. For the movement, the enemy was the invisible hand of whiteness. Invisible because the post-1994 constitution and the political discourse that arise from it made South Africa unconscious of its colonial relations and their continued reproduction in the post-democratic dispensation. White society, through the insertion of democracy in South Africa, in the South African colonial structure, was able to continue to amass the colonial bounty, and white capital, the colonial surplus value, to reproduce the very same conditions of colonial society under the guise of free and equal society with rights guaranteed by the Constitution. More than anything, this is what theoretically sets out the RMF movement apart from other popular protest movements that have emerged in the post-1994 dispensation. The question of the future for RMF movement, for example, is not what kind of South Africa we want. For this question takes for granted a very much fundamental question, the question of South Africa itself, which was central to the RMF's political theorization. While the demands of RMF movement are outside of and demand the repudiation of the idea of South Africa and its constitution, the Fees Must Fall movement, on the other hand, was very much in line with the traditional political movements that have emerged in the post-1994 movement. And I think KK touched on this.
Lindokuhle, can you please conclude now? Thanks.
Okay. So in conclusion, the point is that while RMF was taking back the pre-1994 political subjectivities, Fees Must Fall relies on the idea of South Africa and the South African Constitution to legitimize its demands. While RMF rejects South Africa and they reject the South African Constitution, FISMA4 needs the South African Constitution to be legitimate as a political movement in post-1994. For example, FISMA4 appeals to the ANC government to say that we are not demanding something outside of the language of South Africa. We are demanding something that is enshrined within the Constitution of South Africa, and which was the promise of the ANC government in itself. So the FISMA4, unlike the RMF movement, finds home within the idea of South Africa that the RMF cannot. There, I argue, in conclusion, the RMF movement is in line with Sobukwe in his court appearance when he rejected to appeal to plead in court, arguing that the South African court and the state did not have jurisdiction over him. This is what the RMF does, but FISMA4 appreciates the ANC and the post-1994 dispensation as a legitimate dispensation. And by so doing that, it allows whiteness and white power to recede once again to the background. And what you see then becoming the problem of FISMA4, it becomes again the problem of the black elite. And you find white leftists writing opinion pieces ad infinitum, arguing about the class project of 1996, arguing about how the black elite are doing the same thing that Fanon argued, warned us against the black elite. That is that they will always go against the people. Point is, finally, that these two movements, while they might have found space around the same period of time, are based in two ideologically different spaces. And to argue that they are one and the same thing has been the biggest mistake around the studying of the student protest of 2015. I thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Lindokuhle, and apologies again for intervening and being the kind of Stalinist timekeeper, but that's my job. Thanks very much for your provocations, and this is the space of FISMA4, and I was casting an eye around the room as you were speaking, wondering what the activists of FISMA4 must be thinking about your provocations. And I'm sure that we'll have a wonderful discussion about that. And perhaps I will have an opportunity to express a view or two as well. I'm happy that our last speaker has arrived. Carbon's title of a talk is Remembering the Margins, the Trans Collective's Art Activism. Carbon is a black trans artist, activist, and academic, focus on the liberation of black, queer, trans, and neurodivergent communities in supposedly post-apartheid South Africa. Their multidisciplinary work spans visual, digital, and performance art. Carbon is a Create Fellow and Astria Global Arts Fund grantee and has exhibited at the Queer Feminist Festival and Gallery University of Stellenbosch. Is that you? Okay, so we found the we found the guilty one. In your absence, you had me echoing as well. Okay, Carbon, thanks very much. Over to you, and I will pass a note when you have 3 minutes left. Okay, thanks.
Okay, am I audible? Yeah, okay, great. So, good morning to everyone. I will not be going into presenter view, so we'll just have to look at my presentation in this manner, just because I need to see my notes at the same time. So it won't be the full screen presenter view, but I think it's still visible despite that. Okay. The Trans Collective had lots of slogans and taglines that we repeated a lot over the years. And one of them was giving content to decolonization. And so part of the content that we would be giving is centered around our experiences with Rhodes Must Fall, with the University of Cape Town. Zoom is updating right now. Okay, let's give it a moment. So I'll be tracing essentially the history of the Trans Collective through our art engagements that we had from 2015 onwards. And some of it does include some video work, so we'll see whether we're able to watch some of those videos. They're very short, but it's tracing how art itself is a form of activist work, and that we cannot separate necessarily art from its political origins and its as a political tool in the protest space. Yes, so Zoom is updating. Okay. Okay. Okay, there you go. So we're just going to send it via email and work from there. Okay. I hope this doesn't count as part of my time. Technically, right? Technical issues don't count, right? Right? Okay. Okay, the email is sending. Yes, I've just sent it right now. Okay, perhaps we can go and present a view now because, yeah. No. Yeah, full screen. That's the one. Okay. There you go. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to shift and sit at an angle. Okay. So, oh gosh, no, nothing works. The day you need things to work, nothing works. Oh. We will not be undermined by technology. Yes, the other person does. I'm looking for my speaker notes, which have frozen. Okay. It's opening now on my side. All right, so this presentation will examine how the Trans Collective, sometimes I'll refer to it as the TC, which was a trans-led activist group born from the fissures of the 2015 Rhodes Must Fall movement at the University of Cape Town, and it will examine how we used art to critique the systemic erasure within South Africa's celebrated student uprising. Particularly as we mark the 10-year anniversary of Fees Must Fall and Rhodes Must Fall, this work and this presentation is to interrogate how movements often exclude marginalized voices, even though they champion a decolonial and intersectional rhetoric. Please may we go to the next slide. Okay. So on our screen, we see the two founding members of the Trans Collective, Thatopule and Sandile Ndelu. And I was the third member to then join the Trans Collective soon after this. And one of the most important placards that often get repeated throughout historical rememberings of Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall is "Dear History, this revolution has women, gays, queers, and trans. Remember that." And that we took very seriously as an objective, that we understand history gets made in the moment when we capture and write down what happened that particular day. So if you think about a news article and blogs and tweets and that sort of content, but then history gets made another time when we are 10 years on or 5 years on or 1 year on, and we think back to the historical moment and ask ourselves, what do we include or exclude, whether deliberately or not deliberately, because of our memories. And so the Trans Collective started off with literally a whiteboard marker as a concept that our bodies are political, we are rooted in Black trans queer feminist rage, and there's a sense of sisterhood, which a sisterhood at the time was used because it was centered on trans women at the time. But as soon as other people joined, of course, we reframed that as just a sort of kinship that we'd have between us. So the founding statement, I'm going to read some segments from the founding statement, is that we are a trans feminist movement which positions confronting toxic gender constructs as indispensable to the decolonial project within and beyond UCT. Politically, we are grounded in critical race theory, Black consciousness, and radical intersectionality. The Trans Collective has emerged from a gap in the mainstream political dialogue and in action which invisibilizes the complexities, narratives, experiences, pains, and oppression of trans and gender non-conforming bodies and psyches. We recognize that colonization has had a severe impact on how we perceive gender and gender expression, and thus we're reclaiming our space in the globalized decolonization movement and calling for our narratives to be instructive going forward. Moreover, we problematize the fact that thus far, the gender nuance of this decolonialization project has privileged cisgender voices. And the Rhodes Must Fall was founded approximately in about February of 2015, and we find that the Trans Collective exists merely 2 months later or 3 months later in about April, May of 2015. So I'm very grateful to the insight of our two founding members who were able to identify very early on that Rhodes Must Fall simply had the rhetoric of inclusion, but not the actual practice of inclusion. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so this artwork is my point of entry into the Trans Collective, and then we became a group of 3 people. So I created this artwork called Beyond the Binary, and it was a comment on how the South African ID system fundamentally does not allow for non-binary people to exist. On paper, theoretically, one can change their gender marker on their ID. Will it be difficult? Yes. Will you go from pillar to post? Yes. But there is a legal framework, at least, for transgender people to have their documentations reflect their accurate gender identity. However, this is only in a binarist sense, because 0 to 4 represents a so-called female person and 5 to 9 represents a male person. This is the number that happens straight after your birth date. So the first 6 digits, of course, is your birth date, and then that number is supposed to demarcate your gender identity. And what does a non-binary person like me do? So I'm supposed to be able to have this right to change the gender marker, but how is that even facilitated if all the numbers are taken? And so that artwork was exhibited on the plaza at UCT, and that coincided with the founding of the Trans Collective as well, which at the time we were using Facebook as our main way of engaging with each other. I then messaged the collective, and that's how I've joined since then. So art, for me, has always been my point of entry into the collective. And as we continued, our engagement with art and art as protest and art as activism only grew from here. Next slide, please. So in September of 2015, we went on a campaign to de-gender all the bathrooms of the upper campus at UCT. It was surprisingly easy. You just had to use like a debit card, a student card, anything like that, and you just pop them off. It was very, very easy. Maybe you should try do that too. And and this is because the UCT did have one unisex bathroom at the time across 6 campuses. 6 campuses, there was one unisex bathroom that was like in the dungeon of this one building. And more importantly, it was framed as a unisex bathroom, right? That was the language that was used. And in terms of like kind of the visual representation, it was the kind of bathroom man and bathroom woman that was supposed to represent, you know, the bathroom that I'm supposed to use. The issue with having one bathroom where, you know, trans people or non-binary people or whoever feels most comfortable to go there is that it inherently becomes a hotspot for harassment and targeting. Because if you want to find the trans people, then you just go to the dungeon where they're the only bathroom they can make use of. It's also very impractical because it's on upper campus. What about the satellite campuses? Or are you supposed to travel by bus just to use the bathroom? It doesn't make sense. And so, yeah, the main issue is that, yeah, it wasn't a gender-neutral bathroom. It was unisex. After then, if you see on the left-hand side, firstly, there's 2 things to observe. No, there's 3 things to observe about this image. This is maybe a week after the de-gendering of the bathrooms. UCT replaced all the bathroom signs and then screwed them on with like this kind of nail that, you know, you need like a special screwdriver to use to get it off. Not, you can't use a standard screwdriver from a standard set, which I find is very interesting that the institution responds with such vehement opposition to critique and really re-emphasizes the gender binary and re-emphasizes cis-normativity by making it almost impossible to de-gender the bathrooms now, because you have to sit there and unscrew a specialist screw with a specialist tool to do the same sort of intervention. They then, this is the gender neutral bathroom. They renamed it to a gender neutral bathroom, but still used the same visual aid of the so-called bathroom man and bathroom woman. But most notably, students started to cover up the bathroom man at this gender neutral bathroom. So not only was the institution responding with like an emphasis on on cisgender normativity, we also had students saying, no, this is a girl's bathroom. And they started deliberately covering with posters, with papers, as you can see, to say, we hear you, but we don't. This is a girl's bathroom, this is a woman's bathroom, and that's it. So again, there's this air of antagonism that is at this point cannot be called a microaggression, it's just a macroaggression on how trans people are supposed to exist on this campus. And so, yeah, we still have some of the bathroom signs, like in our houses. We kept some of them. But that was one of the earlier interventions that we did as part of our engagement with the university and what we needed from the university. Please can we go to the next slide? So please do not let it play. There's a SoundCloud link there. So we colloquially called this the mixtape. So we had our founding members, Tatopule and Sandy Ndelu, they ran for SRC at the time. And when they ran for SRC, one of the opposing SRC, not candidates, but rather manager of the candidates in a student formation, sent a voice note to Tato, which starts off very sweet and very supportive of, as marginalized people, let's stick together, that sort of thing. And then erroneously, I think the phone did not stop recording the voice note. And then you hear this kind of like scheming, plotting and planning that this group does. And eventually, I think the voice note, it was just like a technical glitch. And the voice note does eventually send to Tato's phone, and we get to hear this kind of conspiring that happens. So the mixtape is still on SoundCloud if you want to hear it. And it starts, the scheming starts at 1 minute and 18 seconds. And this is the most important thing. We start to see the true value of Black, poor, trans, queer women bodies in these people's eyes. We are nothing but disposable. The only time they recognize our pain is when they appropriate it for themselves. And so this is, again, the antagonism that we experienced at UCT was coming from all angles and from all kinds of student bodies. And we did release a statement when we dropped the mixtape and said, it is no longer sufficient for supposed allies to acknowledge their privilege. We do not need you to acknowledge something that we already know you have. We need you to relinquish those privileges. And one way you can do that is by stepping down so you no longer usurp the space at the university, which is already dominated by your voices. Yeah, please may we go to the next slide. I think we skipped a slide by mistake. Yes. I think what the Trans Collective is probably most known for is the Trans Capture of the Roads Must Fall exhibition, which happened in March 2016. So this exhibition was celebrating a year of Roads Must Fall and had an entire exhibition, predominantly photography. When I say predominantly, I mean like 98% photography from one particular photographer. And at the time, we need to understand that whoever had access to cameras had access to privilege. Whoever had an access to camera had access to narrative. We must understand that the lens with which someone takes photos frames the entire movement. And so, in order for this movement to not allow for this moment in history to be captured and mischaracterized in this way, we intervened at this exhibition. And for the record, we did not stop people from coming into the exhibition. What we did is we laid on the ground at the entrance of the exhibition and asked people to do the very thing that they had been doing the whole time, but just in physical form. Walk over trans people for the sake of this movement. Just do it now. Do it physically, because that had already been done. So let's not mischaracterize as if it hadn't already been done. And so we were inspired by a quote by Kimberly Crenshaw, who of course coined intersectionality, which is, tokenistic, objectifying, voyeuristic inclusion is as at least disempowering as a complete exclusion. So, despite the fact that the Trans Collective formed very early on in Roads Must Fall, we were very active in Roads Must Fall. We didn't necessarily see ourselves as an offshoot that participated in the decolonial project separate to Roads Must Fall. We were there on a daily basis in a Zanya house, in a Zanya hall, doing the work that needed to be done. And it was devastating, just devastating, that when we contacted the organizers of this exhibition, where more than 1,000 photos were on display, some of them were printed and some of them were a slideshow, that out of thousands of videos for people who were there every day for a year, that only 3 out of those thousands of images included any trans person. And of those 3, only 1 we had Tato as the main subject of that photo. So we're not even in the background. We weren't even in the background. that's the extent of the erasure that we experienced. So we intervened, and that is the main point that we have, that RMF will not tokenize our presence as if they ever treasured us as part of their movement. As I began this talk, as I said, history gets made in the moment on how we document that moment through blogs, tweets, reports, daily reports in a newspaper, but it also gets made in the 1-year anniversaries and the 10-year anniversaries and those significant dates. And if we allowed this exhibition to happen in that way and not highlight its exclusionary practice, I don't think I'd be sitting here today talking. Everyone would have forgotten about the trans collective, and let's be honest. Please may go to the next slide. So this is more content from the exhibition. And I like this image on the right because it's what's the max price for Black queer lives is quite, I think, potent. If you didn't know, Max Price was the Vice Chancellor at the time. The next slide, please. Oh, this is a video. We're going to have to skip it in the interest of time. Yes, please. We then, at the end of 2016, created our own documentary called The Promised Land Fallacy as a way to reassert our own way of capturing the narrative and speaking for ourselves. And so the Promised Land Fallacy was directed by Kyla Phil in 2016, and it follows 4 of the founding members of the Trans Collective by taking a snapshot of their lives, concerns, and politics of their time, reflecting on how Cape Town frames itself as a queer haven, as some kind of promised land, but fails to deliver if you're Black, poor, and trans. The Promised Land Fallacy poses the question, is South Africa really post-apartheid? Was anyone ever born free? And how does one exist in the intersection of being queer and African? Please may we go next. We then take a hiatus, right? And from 2016 to 2019, we were working together, we were supporting each other. A lot of us really struggled with our mental health. Naturally, as one would experience the brutality that we experienced in Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. But then we came back and held an exhibition in the exact same gallery space where the trans capture happened. And this time we held it on Freedom Day. That was the opening day. And we called it No Freedom for Trans People. Please go next. And so, oh. And so there is a video going, like I walk around the exhibition space so you can see the types of images, but these is a culmination of all those 3 years. We had continued to work on artistic projects. However, we kind of kept them knowing that we were going to build up to this exhibition and more importantly, reclaim the very space that was, used to try and erase us. Please may I go to the next slide. And in that same exhibition, I hosted a performance art piece called Blackout, and it's very simple. It's an audience interactive performance piece where the audience was left with a trans body against a Black background and a tub of paint with 3 paintbrushes. There were no instructions, there was just that. And I want the audience to do what they instinctively do every day, censor trans people without any prompt or instruction. So this is a video showing one of the people coming to paint my body. And it's very interesting that people don't necessarily prior any kind of critical examination about what they're doing. People were very enthusiastically erasing me and allowing me to disappear into this Black background with very, 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 very little consideration about the implications of what they're doing. Yes, some of the videos, just so we can see. So as you can see, I literally disappear as the painting continues. So what's next for the Trans Collective? I'd like you to think of us as a volcano. We are dormant, but we're not dead. Okay, so we are working on smaller projects. We are interested in making the Promised Land Fallacy a series. We're interested in every about 10 years checking in with the same characters and seeing how has our lives progressed as we reconsider, you know, the struggles of being trans. We are interested in creating a support group for transgender teachers. That's my baby because I am a teacher, so I'm quite interested about other trans teachers and their struggles within primary and secondary education. And we're interested in creating a kind of magazine or zine project which kind of captures the kind of queer artistic life as it exists now. And so that's kind of what we're busy with in terms of projects. So we are dormant, we are not dead. We want to continue giving content to colonization. And maybe the movement itself, Rhodes Must Fall, might be over, but to be abundantly clear, the work is not done yet. And so I know it's just 10 years, but there's still another 10 years on. So let's keep on fighting the fight for free decolonized education. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carbon. You know, this colloquium is entitled Remembering Movements, and I think it's entirely appropriate that you've placed erasure at the center of us remembering. That large image was perhaps the most powerful example I've seen of erasure. So thank you very much for that. I've not seen it before, so it's really extremely powerful. Okay, we have half an hour for questions, discussions, commentary. I'm going to impose the same kind of time discipline on the audience as I have on the speakers. And thanks again for sticking to the time and giving us enough time for conversation. So please, I can see all the activists around and they like making speeches at any opportunity. And so I'm going to appeal to you not to do what you normally do, be sharp, crisp, and to the point, so we can then get a couple of rounds of questions in this conversation. And then I'll come back to the panelists. I hope that Lindokuhle is still around and give you an opportunity to respond to any comments or questions. Can I get an indication, a show of hands? And I'm going to give you a number because I don't know everyone. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, we'll take a couple more after that, but let's just go 1. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Tana Makoka. I just have 2 questions. One for, is Lindokuhle still there? Okay, so one for Lindokuhle and one for Lindy. Lindy, I mean, obviously you had so much to say and not enough time. And so you start talking about the Grenada Revolution in 1979, I think it was. And you talk about how the ordinary Grenadians, is it called Grenadians? I'm not sure, were very involved, besides the PRG. But what happens before 1979? I mean, obviously 1979 is a big rupture, but how were they mobilized before that date? And then for Lindokuhle, I really liked what you were saying about you can't talk about Marikana without speaking about the spirit of Rhodes and the migrant labor system and the mineral industrial complex and all of that he very much spearheaded. Why do you think it is that that idea, linking what is essentially a student movement to the broader political economy of South Africa, did not come through as strong enough for ordinary South Africans to understand that point? Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Chair. Mine is a comment. Malindi, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Your presentation here, you have taken me back memory lane. the story you have been articulating here, I was taught it by another friend of mine, whom I had not seen for the past 30 years up until the chair invited that person. I met him here. I don't know, Chair, do you still remember Mr. Khulisumuzi? Thank you. That was 2 years ago, right. So why am I saying you have taken me memory lane? We were in Botswana by then with Khulisumuzi. Then it was soon after the toppling of Bishop Morris in Grenada. Then who says to me, yo, something serious have happened, you must go and gather. There are some students near the University of Botswana there. Then I said, no, man, what is it all about? Then we went there. There were a lot of students there. So there was a lot of discussion about this Grenada story, and the Bishop Morris was toppled, according to the news, like Lindy said. It was under Mr. Ronald Reagan by then. Because Bishop Morris had said the statement you just quoted here to say, Grenada is not a backyard of anybody else. So it annoyed the American administration to the extent that Mr. Reagan had to send about 300 commandos to go and remove him from power. So thank you very much for taking me memory lane. This has been a very good research. Thank you.
Hello. Is the sun coming up? Oh, yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Chris. Actually, I have a question for, is it Carbon? Yeah. I just want to know when it comes to the bathroom part, where you say that you're advocating for construction of not a bathroom that can be unisex, or because my question is, you advocating for a bathroom that should be unisex or specifically for transsexual people? Because I'm a Congolese man, so there's not actually space for this particular matter in my country. I don't know if I should say we are 20 years back. I don't know if I should say that. Even if I say we are 20 years back, so that means Donald Trump USA should say the same thing as well, because he doesn't want to cross that line as well. So I'm not really quite educated when it comes to that matter of gay, LGBT, because yeah, that's the country I'm coming from. There's no discussion at all when it comes to this particular matter. So I want to know, are you advocating for the construction of a unisex toilet, or a bathroom specifically for trans people? Because within the community of trans people, I believe it's still split. You have trans women and trans men. So why should it be offending? Like, why should it be bad if we have like binary, we live men and women? Because a trans woman can still use a bathroom of women, and a trans man, a transsexual, I don't know, I don't even master the words. A transsexual man can still use a bathroom for men. I don't know, like, can you just enlighten me when it comes to that? And don't hesitate to stop me if you think I'm crossing some line, even if we live in a democratic country. Yeah.
Okay, I just have a question for KK. That's why I'm jumping in, because I thought then everyone will have one. So there's two parts to my question. The first is around the right to protest and unsanctioned gatherings, as in they don't apply for permission, and the link between that and violence. So one, your response to the idea that has come up in research multiple times, that violence, although often coming from within protest movements, is largely in the beginning the result of a reaction towards police violence. And second to that, during FISMA's fall, universities utilized the courts in order to suppress protest action. Particularly, interdicts were used and granted by courts. I wonder what your view on that would be. Thanks. Okay, I have a question for KK. And I think also, I'm not sure, the guy that was also online, I'm not sure his name. I'm not sure. And I also have a question for Carbon as well. My question also actually a comment, but I'd like for you to enlighten me more with the fees must fall and so forth. I was pretty young when the fees must fall was really popular and so forth. So I'd like you to enlighten. You mentioned that the courts were conservative, right? And I would like you to more in practical terms maybe explain as in conservative, because I do agree with you when you say that students today really don't have an opportunity to protest like before, which I agree with. My focus is on COSAS, and one of the main points the students were protesting against fees must fall because, as you mentioned, things like unemployment at home, which they've also detailed about the socioeconomic issue that they had, that their parents were not working and so forth. So in practical terms, can you explain how would you say the courts were conservative? And I'm guessing in relation, I heard that some students were arrested and so forth. So how was that in relation to, I would say, some of our laws in South Africa? Another question, the presenter mentioned the ANC. And I would like him to also enlighten me with the fees must fall in the ANC and the interlink between that and how that affects the fees must fall, concept as well. Another question for Carbon is, I just wanted to ask in terms of numbers of the organization, how do you think the trans people, like in terms of numbers, how many were you? I just want to ask as in, do you think that maybe there isn't a lot of trans people in your school or university that, I don't know, not to say that the organization should be more popularized or anything, and also in practical terms, in terms of number, the members of your organization, do you think that was a huge factor towards the success of your organization or not?
My question just kind of feeds off Taz's question. I think another question around political economy from that side of the room. I just wanted to find out what space Marikana and the massacre occupied in the political imagination of Fees Must Fall in the early days, but also later on when the state's violence increased. What role they played, both in the politics and in the imagination.
I think that we'll pause there and just ask the panelists to respond. There were some questions directed at you, but you may also want to comment on other things. Again, try to be brief so we can have another round, and I'll also give you an opportunity to make concluding remarks. So let's just take it in the order that people spoke. Lindokuhle, can we try to bring you in? Let's hope the technical issues are sorted out.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Very well. Please go ahead.
No, thank you. I think there were just two questions. Sorry, two questions that focused to me specifically. One was the question around the link between the roads and the multifaceted links that it has to the lives of Black South Africans, and why do I think this did not find much resonance with people, the majority of our people? I think it did. I would slightly disagree with the questionnaire. Whether it was roads and stuff, the people identified with and how they affected in their lives. But I do think that the idea in which the Roads Must Fall movement pushed around this Roads Must Fall with this road statue, they actually resonated. In another paper that I specifically focused on the Roads Must Fall movement, I focused on the question around how do you explain the fact that Andres Tatane was killed on live television, 1 o'clock, with all of us watching our news, and there was no huge uprising in the country. The Marikana workers, we saw it live on TV being shot by police. But the kind of response that society had is not the same that they did when a student simply threw human excrement on a lifeless statue. I think that's something that shows that the movement touched a nerve on a number of issues that people resonated with, because it also, this is why I focus on this idea of the new political subjectivity that the movement brings about. Because with Andres Tatane and Marikana, we are not really moved that much as society, simply because we already know that this is what happens to poor people. This is what happens to a worker. These subjectivities are not completely new, but there's something that this Rose Must Fall movement does that gets people's emotions high up, even though it's just a lifeless statue compared to actual lives of people with these two other ones. So I don't think it didn't resonate. Maybe the specificity of Rhodes himself as a man and how he fits in our daily lives did not really get taken up. But I do think that the idea did really find quite good resonance with our people. The second one, and I think the last one, is on the ANC and FMF. So the link between the two, I argue, is that fees must fall. The relationship between fees must fall and the ANC is one of adversaries. Fees must fall looks at the ANC as its main fundamental enemy, because it is the ANC that's not executing a policy of free education. It is the ANC that is defunding universities, forcing universities, if they want to keep up the standard, to increase their own fees, which is different from the relationship that the ANC and the RMF movement have. The movement between the ANC and RMF, while it is a tenuous relationship, it is not one of adversaries in the same way that FMF has. The RMF sees the ANC as an irritation in the struggle for Black people in South Africa, but is not the enemy of the people. What remains the enemy of the people in the RMF lenses remains the white superpower. And I think that's the answer to that last question. I think I satisfied the chair. Thank you.
Thank you for the first question on the link of violence with protest. And I quickly went to the judgment, the Mlungana judgment again, and did a quick search. The court discusses violence 28 times. And at all times, it just dismisses the argument that if you don't give a notice, it means you intend to become violent. It says, the court even says at some point that, sometimes police presence itself quells the violence. But then it also links and says, the mere fact that the mere fact that you give notice does not equate to non-violence. So it just says the link between protest and violence is non-existent. And also, there's a study I cited earlier whereby the vast majority of protests in this country are not violent. There's protest every day for all manners of things I've mentioned. Sometimes protest is not about because you don't have a forum. Sometimes it's just to show force. And sometimes when you want to show force, you don't want your force to be attached with violence, and therefore you just march from Bree to the Constitutional Court, or you march from wherever. The vast majority of protests in this country are not violent, and I'm glad that the Constitutional Court really dealt with this issue of if you don't give notice, it means you intend to be violent, and vice versa. To your second question about interdicts, in law we've got what we call slap lawsuits. So you've got this very vibrant community leader and you want to frustrate him. So what do? You take him to court on one thing or another. You take him to court on defamation, you take him to court on trespassing, so constantly just to suppress him. And I find that interdicts directed at protesters are somehow a long stretch to slap. You want to frustrate them. Rather than have them on the street voicing their discontent, you just want to have them sit in court the whole day, postponement tomorrow, the whole day, postponement tomorrow. So I agree with you that interdicts are somehow, can be used by institutions to show force themselves by dragging into court all the time. Lastly, on the question of why I said the courts were conservative. I said the court were conservative because they framed the question as is Section 12 of the Gathering Act anti the right to protest. But in the rest of the judgment, the court spoke about violence. The court spoke about the history of protest in this country. The court spoke about the impact of apartheid laws in tempering down dissent against apartheid and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying is that the court should have came out clearly and said, the question before this court is whether the right to protest is important to the right to property. The question before this court is whether the right to protest is more important than the right to life, because all these were answered one way or another in the judgment. So you don't invoke other rights in the judgment, yet the question before you put it as if it's a, no, we're just answering Section 12 of the regulations of the Gathering Act. Come out, be clear about it and say, we are saying the right to protest is more powerful than the right to property. We are saying the right to protest is more powerful than this bureaucratic means of just frustrating people through notices. But I hope the organizers allow maybe myself to share this. I put more effort in preparing this paper. So I would appreciate it if maybe at some point you would be able to read it and see this argument I make that the court should have been forthcoming in posing the question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question, which because it leads to the next point I wanted to make. Leading up to the revolution, there was actually only 12 people who were involved in the coup, and this has been focused on by a couple of people who make the argument that because of Grenada's small size, basically an open organization of a revolution couldn't happen in a way that it could happen somewhere else. So basically, it was kind of necessary for it to be this very clandestine, secret organization with this element of surprise. But then the argument goes on that this kind of ingrained a kind of clandestine secretness at the heart of the revolution. So whatever its achievements were in terms of democratic experimentation, democratic participation, there was this kind of foundational secrecy. And I think that that is relevant for thinking about other kinds of politics in small spaces, in surveilled spaces like the university, where you know that, you know, if you're going to do something in the middle of Solomon House, then the university is immediately going to know. On the other side, if you do something secretly, it introduces an undemocratic element. So that is a point that I am happy to be able to make today. So thanks.
Thank you. I got two direct questions, and then I also want to talk about interdicts. Yes, so the first question was what I'm going to call the bathroom debate. It's not really a debate when one side is clearly correct, but yeah, that's fine. So the essence of your question is, like, what exactly am I advocating for? Like, what do I actually want at the end of the day, right? Okay. So even if we let go of the semantics of, is it unisex, is it gender neutral, like, I can let that go, right? At the end of the day, like, it's deep, but it's not that deep, in the sense that all of us just want to pee. We want to have somewhere in public that is clean, safe, and private, so we can do our business. And then we can wash our hands and leave, right? That's the essence of it. And I think everybody deserves to have a space in a public, you know, forum and space to do that act, because it's a human function, because we're not at home. And I think we can agree with such a simple premise, but sometimes it becomes such a radical position when it's not. You just need to pee. Okay. So ultimately what I'm advocating for is that we should have bathrooms that are single stalls that are private, right? And then you leave that single store, you're able to lock it, you're able to do your business, you're able to leave, you're able to wash your hands. And I do think they should be multi-gendered. That's ultimately what I advocate for. Now, there's this thing that we've observed called the trans panic defense that is prevalent, particularly in North America, where if a trans woman, and to be abundantly clear, trans women were generally assigned male at birth, but are women. When they enter the woman's bathroom, that's always the most contentious version of this bathroom debate. And so sometimes, and most of the times, if someone is able to identify that they are a trans woman, that they weren't assigned female at birth, this trans person gets attacked on the basis that they're trans, when it's very simple. They were out in public, they needed to pee, and so they went to the bathroom, right? And the premise of this trans panic defense is this idea that if we allow trans women to use the bathroom that cisgender women use, we are opening cisgender women up to sexual violence. Because someone who is nefarious will and we're characterizing, it's very narrow, we're characterizing the perpetrator as a man in this sense, right? So also that analysis is a bit weak. But nonetheless, men will dress up as women and say they are trans women and go to the bathroom for the purposes of harassing women. Now, let's be for real right now. Do you really think a little image of a woman in a dress is going to stop a perpetrator from doing what they want to do? The devastating example that I have is that little girl who was at the Dross family restaurant. She went to the bathroom on her own, and a person who decided that they are going to harass and assault that little girl went into that bathroom and did exactly that. The sign is not magic, okay? If people want to be an assaulter and they want to harass, they will. Whether we allow trans women in the bathroom or not. That's actually what's up. So if you're asking me what I'm advocating for, single stall bathrooms, get rid of all the urinals, replace them with an actual single stall bathroom that's lockable, you know, from top to bottom, like it's completely private. Everyone does their business, and for God's sake, please wash your hands. Okay, so that was the first question. The second question was just like this kind of like the practicality, like numbers, right? Like how many people are in the trans collective, how many trans people are, like statistically, we're well aware that trans people are a minority, right? Whether this is intrinsic or rather a consequence of the fact that people haven't liberated themselves from, you know, a binarist convention, you know, but for now, we are a statistical minority, maybe at most 6% has been like the highest, you know, percentage of a population that a projection has made, right? In terms of the trans collective itself, as I did speak about kind of the beginnings and that I was the third member, but we're sitting about 16 members right now. But similar to Rhodes Must Fall, if you're down with the politic, welcome to the trans collective. There's no card carrying status, there's no membership form, there's no like, if you're down with the politic, welcome to the trans collective. I mean, if you want to be in the WhatsApp group, just hit me up, right? But do the work and let the politic lead you. So I don't know whether this question was asked in the sense of like, why was I so flabbergasted at, oh, there's only 3 pictures of trans people out of thousands. I think what you must remember is that Rhodes Must Fall did have a core set of people that were consistently there, of which there were many trans people in that core set of people. Yes, critical mass got reached and some people realized, yo, I'm missing out on a big move. Like a lot of the white students went surfing when campus was shut down. They literally went to Muizenberg to surf for those 3 weeks. I kid you not. So there were moments where there was critical mass and people would come to Azania House to check it out. But there was a core group of people who were there, and trans people were a significant portion of that. That's why that 3 photos out of 1,000 was so disappointing, because the photos were primarily of the core group. Yes, they were kind of like aerial shots or drone shots for bigger things, but a lot of the photography was about that core group who made up Rhodes Must Fall, and that's why it was so disappointing, despite the fact that trans people, yes, we are a statistical minority. And then just the last comment about interdicts. Look, I'm a teacher at the end of the day, right? But I remember that UCT went the interdict route after WITS went the interdict route during Fees Must Fall. And they interdicted a hashtag. Like, what does that mean? You know, like, practically speaking, how do you interdict a hashtag, right? A hashtag isn't it just like a concept? And another point of erasure is in 2017, 2018, a lot of books came out about Fees Must Fall and Rhodes Must Fall and fallism in general. Like, a lot of books came out. And I treated the bookstore as a library. And I went there for the whole day, and I sat and I paged through those books because I couldn't afford to buy books at the time. And so a lot of them failed to mention the Trans Collective whatsoever. And the Trans Collective and Tatopule herself were mentioned as respondents to that interdict that UCT did after WITS did. The only time the Trans Collective, out of the 6 books I picked up or 8 books I picked up, the only time the Trans Collective was mentioned, and this is 2017, was the sentence, and it's etched in my head. And weirdly, the Trans Collective is listed as a respondent. That's in 2017. So when we speak about erasure, I need you to understand that if someone wants to study this movement in 10 years' time, and they only access the novels and books that have been written, the only thing they're going to read about the Trans Collective is that we are weirdly mentioned as a respondent, which speaks to how poorly that research is, because go find out why we're there, right? But that's what's frustrating me, is that I refuse to be forgotten. I will reinsert myself every single time and every opportunity I get, because I don't want this recollection of this movement to forget how central trans and queer people have been.
I'm going to give you a chance to applaud in a second. I'm going to bring the session to a conclusion because we're about 15 minutes over time already. I think that we've had a wonderful set of interventions, provocations, and I wish we had more time. But the colloquium is organized in a way that the conversations will continue. So don't feel that we're ending this particular session and therefore the provocations that have emanated from your inputs have come to an end. We'll carry it into the session after lunch and into tomorrow as well. So thank you very much and for making very powerful points. International legal points. I wanted to comment on, I was hoping that people would comment, the Fees Must Fall would comment about the relationship with the ANC and so on, but you've not done that, and perhaps in another session people can take up the provocation raised by Lindokuhle. So thanks very much, and please join me in thanking our presenters for the session.